Now back to that new human rights report. For more details, Elaine Pearson, Director of Human Rights Watch Asia Division, joins us live. Ms. Pearson, I'll quote you one of the main lines from the preface to this report. Unchecked authoritarian power leaves behind a sea of human suffering. This has been pinpointed as the main reason for the big human rights abuses of 2022. If you could explain that for us very quickly with some key examples.
Well, I think what we're seeing around the world and, here in the Asian region is really strong-arm rulers trying to strong-arm their citizens into submission. And we've seen this in Afghanistan, where there has been a brutal crushing of women's rights. We've seen this in China, where we see the extensive mass surveillance, abusive lockdowns for hundreds of millions of people, that have disrupted people's access to medicine, food, and other basic necessities. We've seen this in places like Xinjiang, and crimes against humanity are taking place in Myanmar, where the junta has overthrown a democratically elected government, and we've seen tens of thousands of people since then arbitrarily arrested, some of them tortured and detained. Even in the countries that claim to be democracies, we have seen weak institutions prone to political capture, and this is why we are seeing a frontal assault on human rights right now in our region.
All right, Ms. Pearson, I'll pick you up on at least two of those. Let's start with China as an example. One of the positive notes from the report is the idea that you could have a new model for global leadership on challenging these abuses to human rights. And there was a positive note sounded on China as well, the fact that in the United Nations, a resolution to open a debate on abuse by Beijing against the Uyghur community, that fell short by just 2 votes, and it could almost have cleared. The problem with this kind of approach is it did not in any way change the treatment of the Uyghurs on the ground. It did not even lead to Beijing conceding in any sense of responsibility for what many rights organizations have felt is going on in the Xinjiang region. This sort of calling out, if it really is meant to improve the lives of, say, the Xinjiang community, is this the way to go?
Well, I think we have to see this in terms of the longer, big picture on human rights. And the reality is, it takes time to make progress on these issues. And sometimes this is about preventing bad situations from getting worse. And I think the international pressure on Xinjiang is making a difference. I mean, we had a groundbreaking UN report that found that crimes against humanity may have been committed in Xinjiang. These are the most grave violations of international law. And then there was a resolution tabled in the UN Human Rights Council. Such a resolution, frankly, on a powerful country like China would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. And I think that shows how much governments are fed up and sick of the lack of accountability from the Chinese government, and that there really needs to be accountability, serious accountability for these abuses. And, yes, the vote was lost in the UN Human Rights Council, but it was very, very close. It was only lost by 2 votes. So I think this shows that the Chinese government is under pressure now about Xinjiang. As to whether the situation on the ground has changed, we know that the government has been under a lot of pressure with the camps, but we also know that that has been exactly why they've been so unwilling to open up access to those camps. I mean, the OHCHR, the Human Rights Office, pressured for years to get access for that report and just faced obfuscation at every turn. I mean, the fact that the report was released at 10 minutes to midnight on the final day of the High Commissioner's term of office shows the lengths that the Chinese government was trying to go to bury that report. And I do think it's a success that the report was able to be released, and at least that vote was called in the Human Rights Council. So it's a step in the right direction, yes. But obviously it's not enough.
All right. China, of course, is the largest trade partner for most countries in the world. But let's look at another country. That's, of course, Myanmar now. And you have called for a regional solution that holds the military government accountable, that being the only, in your point of view, the only long-term solution for what's happening for both the people in Myanmar as well as the Rohingya refugee problem that has essentially moved to Bangladesh. Now, we have seen in the last year or so absolute frustration on the part of ASEAN, unable to put any kind of reasonable pressure that works on the military government in Myanmar. You've called on Indonesia as ASEAN chair to do more on this front. realistically, practically, there is not much more Indonesia can do. Do you think, how would you weigh up the situation?
Well, I think there is more that Indonesia can do as the chair of ASEAN, but I think, ASEAN centrality has basically become a bit of an excuse for inaction. And I think this is partly because of the principle of non-interference, which guides ASEAN and basically means that abusive countries within ASEAN, like the junta, can basically get away with failing to implement the promises that they have made. And that is exactly what we're seeing now with Myanmar. I mean, the junta made certain promises under the 5-point consensus, and 20 months later, those promises remain unfulfilled. So I think the question is really, what is Indonesia as ASEAN chair going to do about this? Is it simply going to allow the junta to kick the can further down the road? Or is it going to call for a review of the lack of implementation and then clear steps, such as potentially even suspending Myanmar from ASEAN if there is no implementation of the 5-point consensus? So I think now is the time for Indonesia, as the chair of ASEAN, to get tough with the junta, because this suffering that is happening in Myanmar cannot continue.
And thanks so much for joining us this evening, Elaine Pearson, Director of Human Rights Watch Asia Division.